Morning and welcome back to the second day of AIIDE. My name is Levi Lelis. I go by him and him pronouns, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Ayanna Howard. So Ayanna, she's a professor and chair of the School of Interactive Computing at Georgia Tech, and Dr. Howard's research focuses on robotics, artificial intelligence, and assisted technologies. Which has resulted in over 250 peer-reviewed publications. Her accomplishments include highlights in the USA Today, Upscale, and Time magazine, as well as being recognized as one of the 23 most powerful women engineers in the world by Business Insider, and one of the top 50 US women in tech by Forbes. Prior to Georgia Tech, Dr. Howard was a senior robotics researcher at NASA's JPL. So let's welcome Dr. Howard. Thanks so much.
Okay, so this might be slightly different than some of the talks you've heard up till now. And so really kind of integrating what I do with, which actually uses some aspects of AI learning as well as gamification, but with what I really love, which is robotics. And so I've been doing robotics now for many years. I started in terms of science-driven robotics, sending robots here, when I was here, sending them to glaciers, both on top and underneath the surface. And when I came here about 5 years in, I started rethinking about robotics and impact and what we really could do. And even though I was impacting science, it was through scientists. With robotics as a tool, and I really, okay, we all have egos. I wanted to really directly impact something, and I didn't quite know what it was. And so what I did and what I do now is quite different than what I did at NASA, but it incorporates all the things that I learned in terms of robotics and control. I was classically trained as an electrical engineer, so I started off as a control person and then moved into this aspect of learning from humans and things like that. And so what I do is I develop robotics and gamified technologies for children with special needs, which is nothing like sending rovers to Mars, right? So it's like quite different, but if I think about the kind of transitions that was required. One is scientists. They have a different language, like pure scientists. There's a different language, even though they're more technical than maybe a therapist. They still speak a different language, and learning how do you work and interact with domain expertise and get their knowledge so that it works with your robotic systems. The other thing is providing them feedback. It's one thing to say, hey, my robot works, but what does that actually mean? What kind of things do they need to understand? What feedback is required to know that the robotic systems work? And so all those things, those lessons learned, really worked well with working with therapists, working with clinicians, and working with children with special needs. And children are hard, and so I'll talk a little bit about that. So one, I want to lay the foundation on disabilities. And one of the reasons is when you start working in this domain, working with children with special needs, you understand like the impact we as technologists can really have on this world. And the reason why self-interest, so disability, just classical definition, is the one that typically researchers like in this space, is that it's a change in your normative function. And so what does that mean? It basically means that if you, say you're a basketball player, anyone basketball player in here? Okay, tennis. So say you're a basketball player, tennis player, and that's your livelihood. And then as you get older, because we all do age, hopefully, maybe you get something, arthritis, or tennis elbow, or some aspect. Now your normative function has changed, and you may not be able to play as much. And now, what are you supposed to do? Just sit home and watch TV? No, you actually cognitively are able, you still can run, but maybe you can't really function. That's a change in your normative function. And so if that is linked to a deterioration in body function or a deterioration in your brain cells or memory, then you have a disability. And so the fact is that in countries like the United States, Europe, Japan, in basically countries that are at higher economic status, you will live with a disability if you live long enough. And we all want to live long enough, right? And so if you think about that, that means that the technologies we create today are possibly the ones we're going to use in the future. So it's a really good time to start working on it now, so that when you are 70 and 80, you can look back and be like, oh yeah, I can now have something. I can still work, I can still function, I can still go to the gym without having to be put in, say, in nursing homes, which may not exist. And so if you think about it, it's like one of these areas where you can work in it, and it could be even your secondary, because there's things that you do in your lab, in your research, that applies to this space. And so that's kind of the platform I sit on, and I always say that because I don't think we do enough in this space, and the number in terms of disabilities is growing. It grows every year, and one is because our healthcare is much better again in these countries. It's typically, if you were, for example, a veteran and you went off to war, you wouldn't come back. Now you come back and you survive, but now you might have a disability. And so because of that, the numbers are rising. So for kids, can we get it?
I'm not sure.
Okay, I'll use my,
in the meantime,
my class voice in the auditorium. No, our classes are so large. So if you have now, if you think about the disability numbers, right now there's a diagnosed about 150 million children with special needs, with disabilities. And so we think that we think that number is actually higher. And why? It's because there are still some countries that don't report correctly, right? If you're a parent and you have a child with a special need, some parents, it's still not an acceptable norm. And so we actually think that that number is higher, but we're just gonna go with the 150 million. In the US, if we look at the pediatric rehabilitation, so that's not education, that's not looking at the educational needs, just in therapy and rehabilitation. Now I'm not touching it. $1.6 billion in terms of an industry. And so think about that. Kids become teenagers, become adults, become older adults. And so think about what this does in terms of numbers, in terms of access, in terms of the technology that's available. And so there is a large market and a large ability to do something impactful. I work primarily two large demographics, children with cerebral palsy. I'm interested in how to use robotics for addressing motor limitations. Cerebral palsy, 1 in about 300 kids are born with CP. A large majority of them have impairments in their motor function. And then I also work with children with autism, not necessarily because of the aspects of developmental milestones, if you're thinking about socialization and things like that, but a large number of children who are on the spectrum have a motor limitation, which of course I didn't know until I started in this space. And so what it means is that the same kind of methodologies we designed and developed to assist originally with children with CP in terms of movement and exercise apply to the other target demographic. And children with autism is much larger, so 1 in 50 versus 1 in 300. And so when we're doing our trials, we're going into the home, we're just as so our inclusion criteria is basically a motor limitation. We're just as likely to get a child with autism as well as a child with CP in our studies, which means that we had to address a couple of things. And so how do you do this space? Remember I said I started at NASA, science-driven robotics, I work with scientists, trying to figure out what is this whole therapy world, what does it look like? And so even when we were doing the work with scientists, the first step is trying to figure out what is the problem. I think a lot of times, and I made this mistake too, like my first project, I designed out of the lab, designed out of my own experience, which was totally wrong, right? And so going into this domain is saying, what are the problems? What are the actual problems that we're trying to solve? Not the made up problems that we just like to write about, but what are the real problems in terms of the target demographic? Because we can always create new technology, we can always write up cool articles and do our little pilots, but it won't have the impact. And I really wanted to have that impact, else I would have stayed in science-driven robotics. And so it involves, and when you're dealing in healthcare, it involves a long relationship building process. It involves going into the clinic, observing clinicians and kids working together. It involves going into the special education school systems. It involves, keeping your mouth shut and saying, yeah, that's not efficient and that's not optimal, but asking the questions like, oh, why did you do it that way? That seems interesting. Not saying that it's not efficient, because it's not, but really having them be the domain expert and observing and trying to figure out what are the pain points, and then having a conversation like, oh, I noticed you did it this way. You know, we can design technology to do it this way, and having that conversation. And so what happens is, after a while, after you observe, after you build this relationship, clinicians, kids, parents are so much open. They're so open to saying, okay, now let's try what it is. And if it doesn't work, which it doesn't the first time ever, like if it doesn't work, it's like, okay, we are now going to work with you on your technology to ensure that it actually improves, that it actually works for our needs. And so you then have this back and forth, and it's one of the most wonderful things. So a couple of challenges with robotics. The easy part is, a lot of times, if you think about bringing in technology, the question is are they going to adopt it? Are they going to take it, use it, and put it in the closet, or are they going to use it for an extended period of time? Robots are easy, right? Like, everyone loves a robot. Like, we don't have this problem of, here's a robot, and our robots are socially interactive. There's never a problem of bringing in a robot and saying, you know, here, use it, and then we come back, and they're like, where's the robot? Oh, it's, where's the robot? It's, I don't know where the robot is. Like, we don't have that problem, because our robots are cute and interactive and those aspects. And so that's an easy thing. Now, maybe in 10 years, when everyone has their robot, maybe it won't be so easy, but right now, and when we started on this about 5-6 years ago, well, now 10, I'm getting old, it's easy. It's easy in terms of the adoption. The problem is that kids are different. And when I started in this space and I was like, oh, children with cerebral palsy, motor disabilities, I got it. I totally understand that. No, I did not. So what would happen is you would see a child that had a diagnosis. And so there's these clinical scales that clinicians use to talk about movement in terms of how they're moving and how they're working. And they're very coarse scales. And so the way that you do an assessment is there's a set of tasks that you would have a child do. And you would basically, you know, did they achieve it? Did they partially achieve it? Did they not achieve it? Right, so very coarse, and they add up all these numbers and they come up with this scale. And so this is roughly what this is. And so when you have a child that's on this scale that is, and it goes from 1 to 5, that's at a, say, 1 or 2, it doesn't mean anything. It just means that they have a mild impairment in terms of limitations in their mobility. So that could mean that you have a child who might have a slight limitation in what they're doing in terms of reaching. So we have one of our kids, and you might notice a little bit, there was a bent hand, so slight limitation in upper body movement. But that same child, or a different child, I'm just yelling, or a different child, it may, no, it's not user error.
Yeah, no, I believe
technology,
it.
as I've learned. But you might have a child with the same diagnosis of it too, that has beautiful capability in terms of upper body, but when they walk, they have a limitation in their gait. And so maybe they have a slight limp. They're getting the same scale as 2, right? And so as a technologist, it can drive you crazy because you're like, okay, a metric is a metric, right? Like, it should be this box, and everyone in that box should be the same. And it's not the same. And so one of the things we had to learn is, given that when we have a child, the only thing we can even know as truth, as our baseline, is, you know, maybe age, maybe gender, that they have a diagnosis, and maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? That's what we know. And so we very quickly learned that our robots had to adapt. Like, and they had to, in order to basically say, what does 2 mean? Okay, we have to figure out what this 2 means. Okay, we're going to do a set of tasks with the child to see, well, is this an upper body movement? Is this a gait movement? We have to see, is it the left hand? Is it the right hand? Which is the involved side, or which is the dominant? And so that became part of the technology, is it has to adapt. It has to figure out its own baseline from the very beginning. The other thing that's a challenge is that kids are, how do I say it? They don't pay attention, right? So, and we're now for 2 years we've been working with infants, talk about not paying attention. They don't even follow directions. Like, at least kids follow directions sometimes. And so what this means is that, and it's actually, there's a reason for it. So if you think about kids and how they grow and how they develop,
for them, like for you guys to sit here for an hour, I mean, honestly, this is an acquired behavior, right? It's acquired behavior. You probably can get, and I tell my students, you probably can get what I'm saying in like 30 minutes, but we design our classes for an hour, right? So there's so much information you get, but you cut off after a while. The brain just doesn't absorb that same concept. I'm done. I understand. Robots, socially interactive, I got it. Let's store that. Let's move on. Kids are like that, but they're developing and designing and trying to figure out the world around them. So if I'm trying to figure out a cause and effect, or what is that object that I see on the ground? Okay, I'm going to pick it up. You're not going to start eating it for an hour, right? If you don't like it, you're just not going to like, oh, I'm here for an hour. Let me keep doing this because my mom says so. No, you're going to take it, and as soon as you can figure that out, you're like, oh, I'm done. Throw it away. And that's one of the reasons why, I don't know if any of you have kids, toys do not, they have toys and they last for just a certain amount of time and then it's discarded. It's not because they didn't like the toys, whatever it is that they needed to get out of that functionally, unless they're like love it like their teddy bear, they're done. They've learned about it. Okay, let's go to the next learning opportunity. And so our robots had to figure out things in terms of engagement and disengagement. If I'm engaging with the child and the child's getting bored, the child's not going to learn, the child's not going to follow the directions, and therefore the robot has to identify that state in the child and figure out what should it be doing that's different so that it can then re-engage the child. What that meant was that our robots had to be socially interactive. I was classically trained as an engineer. I had not taken cognitive science, psychology, understanding this aspect of what is an emotion, but that was an input that was required for my robots to adapt and learn. And understanding that emotional state was part of the requirement. So our robots are socially interactive, not because I believe robots should have emotions, but they need to have emotions and recognize emotions so that they can evoke and have an optimal interaction with the kids in question. And so that was also a challenge, and how we learned from that is that we have these socially interactive robots. So when you put it all together, what you have is a system that has a child, a robot, and sometimes you'll have a parent or sometimes a clinician. I'll show another video because that's not. So what does the system look like? We have to use therapy. So what is our mechanism for therapy? We have physical, where you might move physical blocks in the environment. But we found that works, but that's actually kind of boring. And so most of our therapy is built around games. Games are one of these things that a child likes, explores, can be engaged for hours, and you just change the game, but you can still have this aspect of the same protocol. What is it that you're trying to get the child to do? We have to evaluate, so this is the feedback. Robots are cute, they're playing with the kids, but if the clinician cannot see what's going on, is the child improving? It doesn't make any sense. It's like, okay, that's a toy, buy it at the almost non-existent Toys R Us, which now has opening 2 new stores. But this is what that is, and then of course the robot is this exercise coach, this therapist that interacts and guides the child. And one of the things I say is it guides the child, and I'll talk a little bit at the very end on ethics. This is my other big thing. We are actually manipulating behavior, which comes with some ethical concerns. It's guiding the child, it's optimizing, it's improving outcomes, but at the end of the day, we are also manipulating what they're doing. We're guiding for their best benefits, which comes with some ethical concerns. So I'll talk a little bit about that toward the end. So how do we gamify this technology? So we use 2 aspects. One is virtual reality, and why virtual reality? So one of the things is, if you are an adult and you're looking in the mirror and you wave, you can see yourself waving, right? If you are not in a mirror and you wave, at this point you know you're doing it right? And if you suddenly had an injury, say you were playing tennis and you had an injury, and you're trying to wave, you know the difference. You know that you don't even have to look at your hand to know the difference. You're like, okay, it's not waving exactly the same that it was waving before. Mm-hmm. You know the difference. Now imagine you have a child who was born with a disability. How do they know this difference? Like, this is the way they function, this is the way they work, this is the way they pick up objects. How do they know that it's not the correct way? the only way is observing others, but we find that the best way is observing themselves. So if they can see themselves and they're old enough, and so we work with typically cognitive age of 5, we find that at that point they can observe themselves and they can correlate it with, oh, that's not the way so-and-so was doing it. So they're able to correlate that. And so we use virtual reality because it allows them to not only see themselves, so we put their image with the camera, and then we have objects where they pop and play and move things around, doing things like, so here's an example of a child interacting with the game. So they can see themselves, they can play, but then they can also have this inner correction of, wait, this is not quite correct, this is not working, or I thought I was going to hit that bubble, but I didn't, so what do I need to do? Okay, so I see my hand, I see the bubble, I need to correct what I'm thinking to what I'm actually doing. And so that's how we use this virtual reality aspect, again, with the robot. The other way that we use is we use tablet-based games. And so tablet-based games allow us to, let's see if any of these play, nope, allow us to interact at a more local scale, but it also allows us to have kids who might have a more severe disability in terms of interaction. So if you have a mild disability in terms of limitation, you still have pretty good range of motion. If you have a severe disability, it means that you have more limitations in your range of motion in terms of midline, so taking your hand and crossing it over your body is more difficult. Whereas if you have this local space, we can work with the child in this local space, get them to move, get them to interact, understanding cause and effect before we move them into the larger space. And so it allows us to do these aspects. And then metrics. So I talked about the scale from 1 to 5, and that's like the gold standard. That's what's understood. That's what everyone kind of knows. But what happens, and I can't just say 1, and what's the improvement like? Like, I might know that they're improving, and what we found through our observations is that parents would come in and be like, my child's improving, but it's not showing up in this record. And I know my child is improving. Like today, this morning, they were able to lift up the fork for the first time. I know that they're improving. And the clinician is basically looking, it's like, I can tell because they're getting better at the task, but the measures aren't showing that, right? The measures aren't showing that. And so how do you provide them information with this system that shows that the child is improving, but not associated necessarily with the measures? But how do you do it? Because a clinician can say, yeah, of course it's improving. Yeah, we know this, without being able to quantify it, right? They have to be able to quantify it so that when it goes to the next clinician and so on. And so we developed a number of kinematic parameters, but we had to do a couple of things. One is we had to look at the parameters that were accepted in at least some of the literature, that not necessarily with the scales, but some of the literature with clinicians. So clinicians, PTs, do research, they look at these movements. So we had to extract that, but we also had to figure out how does it correlate with these gold standards. So if there is a child who has is diagnosed and has a scale of 2, what does that mean with respect to these kinematic measures? And at what point does the change in these measures go to a 3? And how do you associate that? And so we had to figure out that correlation so that it could be used as a tool for these clinicians. And so we did a bunch of, I feel like I was yelling. We did a bunch of tests that allowed us to do this. Take these measures, quantify them, take them and associate it with the scales. And we had an accuracy, so our best case in terms of accuracy was range of motion. So shoulder range of motion, elbow range of motion was about 5% in terms of an error. And our worst, this is average, it was path length. So path length was if I'm going from one point to another, what is that distance? That was some of our worst errors in terms of the deviation. And so we thought this was pretty good. Like, okay, this is, this is acceptable. I would have liked like 96% for like all measures, but this seems like it's acceptable, especially since it was one of the first times that we could do it. And the thing about this is that it looks great, it looks awesome, but does it correlate and can you translate to the clinical domain? And so in the clinical domain, anytime you come up with a new measure, anytime, it doesn't matter what it is, you have to establish a baseline. So what is a baseline? So some of you might remember, or if any of you have kids, when you go to the doctors, there's usually this chart. They take your height, they measure you, and they pull out this big chart, right? And they show you where you sit or where your child sits on this chart. And they're like, oh, your child's, below the baseline, right? Like they tell you these. They don't say your child's too skinny, right? They'll say, your child's below the norm baseline, and so maybe you should, and they give you some hints. Or if you're way above, child's a little way above, maybe you should do X, S, Y. And so this baseline is an established thing. And so anytime you create a new scale or create a new measure, you have to figure out what is the baseline. So if I have a scale of, say, path length, what does that actually mean? So if I bring in a bunch of kids and do a measurement, what is the norm baseline for a 5-year-old male child, 5-year-old female child? Does it change at 10 and create this baseline so that when a child with a disability comes in, you can measure here's the norm baseline, what is it? Now we're at Georgia Tech. We're not going to bring in a bunch of, and these studies they take years. There was a lot of kids, so you just don't bring in one and be like, oh, here's my baseline. You have to bring in a number of kids that are in different categories of growth to come up with this baseline. We're not going to do that at Georgia Tech. We're just not going to do that at Georgia Tech. So we had to think about, well, how do we create a baseline that would make sense, that we could compare, that we could have hundreds in different categories without having like the physical kid present. And we racked our brains, talked to the clinicians, just trying to figure this out, and we came with a beautiful, beautiful solution. We are going to create robots that have the same parameters as kids. Makes perfect sense, right? So what does this mean? So if you think about robotics in general, there's this whole field manipulation. My thesis was on manipulation, which is basically upper body, you moving around. And what happens is there's these kinematic chains that are used to define a robot arm, right? And so what we did is we took our kinematics, which is well proven control literature. We can figure out everything, singularities, things like this. And we took that and mapped it to the different characteristics of a kid. So we looked at the norm arm length of a 5-year-old and mapped that out. Norm baseline of a 6-year-old. And so we designed this entire framework where we said if we had a 5-year-old child, this is how they would do. And we had it virtually interact with the game. We figured out path length and things like this. And so we created this baseline. And it was great. We got a couple of papers published. Awesome. It was like amazing, fascinating. And the clinician was like, okay, now you have to prove it, right? So how do you prove this? You need to bring in people and actually figure out you said that a 16-year-old had this aspect. Does your model actually correlate with that? And then if that child or that 16-year-old teenager is interacting and you're measuring path length and all these kinematic variables, range of motion, and your model says that these are the baseline functions, do you get the same results? That's a pretty tall order to actually do because the equations look beautiful. And so we did this, and we started with adults. In this case, adults, so I will give a full disclosure. When I say adults, those are Georgia Tech students, so full disclosure. And we did this. So we created our baseline, we had the robot model, we figured out what is the ideal parameters, we then brought in these individuals and tried to figure out. And what we did, is lovely when your math actually matches reality. It doesn't always happen. And so we found out on most of the parameters, so range of motion, which I showed was one of the least errors when we did the assessment when I showed the little video, it matched. And so if you looked at the human model versus our robot model and the parameters, it was right on target in terms of what was acceptable as an error threshold in terms of effect sizes and things like that. Where it was worse, which was also our worst error, was in path length. And so we figured out why, because of course, you know, you're like, why is path length like not, it's not statistically the same, right? It's not, even though it was close, it wasn't the same. You couldn't put them in the same, so our models seemed to be off in terms of path length, but it was correct on all the other parameters. And so digging into it, I claimed, of course, we had a nice debate with our clinical collaborators. I claimed that people are not optimal. Our model is optimal, right? Like path length, you see 2 points, you are going to configure exactly the same. So robots are more optimal. And she said a good point. She's like, yeah, that might be true because, you know, adults would do things like, and then they would use their arm, right? Like, because they would start anticipating where things were. So they were doing things that were gaming the system to basically, you know, have this interaction because people are actually not optimal. And what does that mean? They're optimal in terms of energy efficiency. They're like what we optimize in terms of our movement parameters are different than what we had our robot optimizing on, is basically what was happening. And her point and their point was that this is what you're dealing with. When you go into the field, it doesn't matter that maybe your robot is the most optimal and most efficient. You're dealing with people, and the people are who you have to optimize around. And so people are your gold standards always, even if you think they're wrong, even if you're like, I have no idea what they're doing, they're not following directions, that's your gold standard. And so technology has to be designed around that as a gold standard. That is your baseline, that is your truth, even if you don't believe it. And so lessons learned is that's the truth, that's the baseline, even if it makes no sense. And so, I'm gonna try again.
All right. Even if it makes no sense. And so we're like, okay, we accept that. So we were asking, you know, should we go back to the drawing board, create a new model? She's like, no, this is actually good enough. And why is it good enough? It's good enough on the parameters, not all of them, and you just state that. You just claim that. And when you publish and we talk and we try to figure out, we claim that these are the parameters it works with, and be honest to say these are the parameters that it doesn't work with. And I was like, oh, you can be honest like that? You just don't admit? No. You actually have to claim it, and claim when it doesn't work, when it breaks. Always claim it. And I'll explain a little bit on our studies why that's so important. Then we tried it with kids. Kids don't pay attention. They don't follow instructions at all, right? Like adults, they at least follow directions, and they're not optimal, but they're not breaking the rules, right? Whereas kids break the rules all the time. So for example, if we're looking at their dominant hand or their involved side, they will say use the wrong hand. The rules were use your dominant hand. The rules were not use your non-dominant hand. The rules were, right? Like we have rules and kids don't follow them. And so we were like, okay, this algorithm is definitely not going to work. We don't even know what's going to go wrong or anything. And the fact is that it surprisingly went well. I thought it went horribly, and I'll explain why. It went horribly because there was a bunch of data that just didn't correlate. We literally had to throw it out because we were looking at dominant and they used non-dominant, and you can't average dominant and non-dominant. Of course, that makes sense. And so given the data set that we had, this was typically developing kids, and this was just, remember range of motion was the least error, 5 to 7%. It was bounded, it was in terms of statistically the same, matched with adults, our model and things like that. And for this, we were able to show that it was the same for range of motion, it was actually the same as the adults, which actually, you know, it's one of those things you're like, oh, yay, I have no idea how that worked. But it was. And one of the things is because, and this is the other thing that we learned, is that when you have this data set, like we think about, you know, we have all this data, and sometimes we make up stuff in terms of, well, this person is like way out here, okay, let's look at the data to figure out how do we discard that data, right? And we look like, oh, we do a compliance check. Okay, compliance check is a really good way of just discarding data that doesn't make any sense, right? Like we do things that allow us to make our data really nice, and so you have a nice mean and standard deviation, and everything else it allows us to like throw it out. But with the way that they approach it is that you still throw out data, but the way you throw out data is that you throw out a lot of data. So you do look at this mean and the standard deviation, but the way you throw out data is you look at things like, if we're looking at the dominant hand, you talk about all the things that are in your inclusion. Like, we're going to include this, we're going to include this, we're going to exclude this, we're going to exclude, even before you look at the data. Like, I will admit, a lot of times, even we look at the data after, it's like, I don't understand this point. Like, let's go back and look at the data. Why is this point way out there? And then we come up with the reason of why this point is way out there, and then we write it up, and we're like, okay, we can discard that point because X, Y, Z. The way they do it is that they do everything beforehand, inclusion, exclusion, inclusion, exclusion. And then when they get to the data, they follow what they had at the very beginning. Include, include, exclude, include, include, exclude. And that's it. And so sometimes you have little things that are out, but a lot of times, somehow it fits into that nice like bubble of information that we love to see, instead of doing it after the fact. So a practice that they do, and then what they do is that those extra ones, they put it in, they average, and then they talk about it. Like, and there was this point, and they will have like a little paragraph sometimes of, you know, that person, it was a diagnosis as a 2, but later on we found was really a 4, was misdiagnosed, right? Like, they'll explain these things, but they'll still include in the data assessment. So even with that, it was like surprisingly well done. And if I had done my anomaly detection, like, okay, let's exclude this one for this, we would have came out with the same results. So, now the test. Let's put it out in the field. It seems to work, seems to be adequate. Let's now look at baselines between typical children with this model and children with CP. Let's go out, put out this virtual reality system. We want to see about the learning outcomes, and we want to compare it with these GMFSC scores, like these 1 to 3, or 1 to 5. So our scenario was, we brought in, we did the scales, we did the test, we looked at our parameters at day 0. We ran the system for 4 weeks. We then took another measurement. We ran the system for another 4 weeks, then we took a measurement. And so we wanted to see what would the outcomes be in terms of change in these parameters, and then change in, of course, the scales. The baseline was the typical kids, because they are the baseline and they are the truth. We comparing these kids with respect to our norm, our model, it was not. It was typical kids to the model, and then these kids to the typical. And so what we found is, at the beginning, this was our day 0, that kids with CP, at least the kids we were using, or had participants, were different. Statistically different, so they move differently in terms of path length, in terms of movement time, and movement units. They did not move different in terms of elbow range of motion. And so basically, when they were moving, their elbows still had the same angles, but their shoulders moved differently. Path length in terms of going from one place to another was different. The time it took them to reach a point was different. And the movement units is, anytime you reach, there's this acceleration and deceleration stage, which is basically you kind of move up and you kind of move down. It's detectable. It's not necessarily detectable if you look, but it's detectable when you track it. And so those parameters were different. Mid-test, 4 weeks, we saw that shoulder, like the way they moved their shoulder, those angles was the same. Movement time and movement units were different. 8 weeks, they looked the same. So, what does this mean? It meant it worked. It worked. Like, it totally worked. Like, as a technologist, it's like you think about it, you sort of believe it, right? You write about it, you do some simulations, maybe you bring in some pilots, and you claim success. Whereas this was, you know, and one of the nice things about this is like they do these blinded things. Like, it was out there. The evaluation was done by blinded therapists. They didn't have any understanding or knowledge of the system. They just measured, right? And it actually worked. And then we wrote it up. And there was like 5 pages of limitations. Even though it worked. It worked. what are the limitations? So one is the kids that we were part of this, who were enrolled, and this was part of our inclusion criteria, was that they were either a 1 or 2. Basically, they had a mild limitation, right? The other thing is that they were a cognitive age of 10, which means that they would follow directions mostly, right? So there was all these limitations that we had to write up, and put it in this document. I was like, wait, success? Like, shouldn't that be like the bulk, and like the limitation section is like a column, right? Like, isn't that what you're supposed to do? And she explained it, and so we do this even when we're doing our more technical work, is you don't want someone else repeating your mistakes, right? One, or if you have mistakes, you want someone else to build upon them. And if you don't give enough information, if it's not reproducible, then you have failed this community. Because one, it's not like you can just invite children with CP and like, oh, test this out, test this out. It's a vulnerable population. You don't get that many opportunities. And so you don't want someone else going through an 8-week study when they could have just read, it's like, oh, okay, I need to change my assumptions about this. I don't need to do this. I need to do this differently. Like, that information is so valuable to push the field in terms of having better outcomes. And so part of writing and publishing in this clinical domain is that you spend as much time talking about the limitations as you do on the success stories, which is quite different than I think we're typically used to, right? It's like, oh, that didn't work, that didn't work, that didn't work, that didn't work. That worked, okay, let's publish that, right? Whereas they are, okay, that didn't work, you put it in the limitations. That didn't work, you put it in the limitations. And success, then you write up the publications, but then you admit the things that didn't work. Totally different phenomenon, but it actually makes sense. And so we continued on, we were able to show that, and just in terms of talking a little bit about the robot in regards to everything. So the robot, interactive, cute, engaging, intentionally, right? Like we even choose platforms that have a form factor, and we don't have to use humanoids. So that's sometimes a question, like, do you have to use humanoids? Why are you using humanoids? We basically, because we're looking at upper body motions, we really just need the form factor of moving. But this cuteness and this aspect is this correlation with the socially interactive. Our robots are also they are emotional. They understand emotions. Again, not because robots have like an emotion chip, if anyone's into data, but they do need to emote accordingly. So if we detect that a child is frustrated, for example, the robot can't be, okay, scripted, yay, it's time for saying yay, right? If a child is frustrated, the robot should emote equivalently. It should be empathizing with the child if it's frustrated, like, man, that was hard. Like, let's try again, I know we can do it, right? And if the child is succeeding, you want your cheerleader, right? You want that coach that's like, yeah, we did it, right? So you have to have the robot be emotional. And when you put it all together, what it means is that you can have a system that actually works. So talk about the last study, then go a little bit into the ethics. So we did another study with the robot, because one of the things we wanted to see, like with the first study, the children with CP always had the system. So they were always using the system. One of the limitations was, what happens if they're not using the system, right? Will they still improve over time? Will their performance decrease? And so we had to test out, well, what happens if the robot isn't there? What happens if the system isn't there? Or if the system's there, but you're not getting any feedback? Is the child going to improve? Are they going to maintain those learning outcomes in terms of motor abilities? And so again, phase 1, we had system, getting our baseline for the kids. Phase 2 was the robot being present, providing input, them interacting with the virtual reality system. And then phase 3 was removing the robot and seeing what happens, right? Seeing if the outcomes and the learning, all these parameters maintain. And what we found was that when you remove the robot, there's slight gains, but not a lot. Which of course you're like, oh, we just thought it was like perfect. So this study was just with kids, because we're looking at kids' improvement, so every individual child. And so we saw round 1, so here are typical kids, but the data that I show you on the chart is just children with CP. And what we see is, which is kind of interesting, so there is improvement. Typical kids have a larger standard deviation on their improvement, and I'm just showing you movement time here. And so we have charts for all the other ones. Then when the robot is removed, what we see is that there's a decrease. What's nice is that it doesn't decrease to their start, so what they were at the beginning, but it's not as great as when the robot was there. And so things that we're now doing is we're trying to figure out how long do we have to have the robot there for us to maintain these gains. Like 8-week study is like forever and a day. Like these studies are like 16 weeks. We're just at 16 weeks, and we're still not seeing that same. Clinical literature, if anyone's in healthcare, there's a reason why it takes sometimes a year or 2 years to even get to the point you can publish. Because sometimes these studies can take so long. And so we're trying to get that out before my student graduates. So what's the problem? Humans are trusting. We are changing behavior for the good, but we also know that humans are biased. And so why is this? So one of our other, we use this emotion recognition. I'm just going to give this one example. We use emotion recognition to recognize the emotional state of kids so that we can emote accordingly. The problem is like one of our early studies, what we saw, and this was with children with autism, is we saw when we did our final pilot that there was a difference between the girls and the boys. Small sample size, so it was just a trend. It wasn't statistically significant, but there was a difference. And so we're like, okay, remember, like, oh, there's a little bit of an anomaly. Let's try to figure out what's causing this. You know, is it age, cognitive, like trying to figure it out. And what we found is that remember we had these observations between clinicians and kids. Like, I'm an engineer. My lens was looking at clinician and kids. What we found is that all of our observation data was actually clinician and boys. Why? Because there is a higher incident rate of boys that are diagnosed with autism. I didn't even get that, right? Because I'm just like, oh, kids, like, you know, clinicians, I'm here, this is awesome, collect data, collect data. It didn't even occur to me about the gender, because in the final we had, right, like we had to think about, okay, we need to make sure we have some gender distribution. We basically kept recruiting until we had at least a few girls in our final study. Did not think about it when we were doing the observation and collecting of the data. And so it baffled me, and so this actually started this journey down this whole ethics bias aspect, because I should have seen it, like I should have seen it, and I didn't, until again we were looking at the data. And so some of the things that we did is that there is hope. In order to fix our machine, we were using, so just so you know, the things out there, all these emotion recognition APIs that are out there, of course kids are not part of their training set. I mean, it makes sense, right? Vulnerable population, you're not going to have kids just post their pictures and you scrape it off the web. It's just not going to happen. And so what we've been using were these APIs, and what we then designed was basically a hierarchy, because there's so much power in these APIs that are already out there. It didn't make sense for us to just throw that away, because they had a bunch of data they had trained on. But by putting a filter on top of it, where it could basically recognize with our limited data set, so basically whole data set, everything, put a filter that was specialized, we got the same results as what they claim these APIs have, but for our target data set, in terms of female, boys and girls, in terms of age, we were able to have the same accuracy rate, irrespective of disability, diagnosis, and again, the recognition is based on kids in order to do that. And so what it made me realize is that even though there's a lot of things out there that we're using, and there's a lot of information about, you know, media, bad actors and things like that, I think as technologists, we could design these filters that we add on top of what's already out there to really fix some of these problems. And we're using it now, and it's out in the field, and we're getting the same rates for boys as well as girls. So how far should we push it? I think about this all the time. I've had cases where parents have, you know, been like, oh, you've changed our life. You know, this is like the answer to all of our prayers. And like, no. It's a technology. It's a research project, right? It is not a product. And catering expectations a little bit, but I think we can push it. but I have to always think about the target demographic, parents who have extreme hope on these technologies, because we are showing that there are improved outcomes, but it's not solving everything. And as we know, when you take the robot away, which we do, because these robots are expensive, right? Like, we know that the outcomes are not going to be maintained, at least right now. And so being honest, but still pushing. I didn't show the tablet games, but our tablet games, we do things like Angry Birds, Cut the Rope, like, bootleg version. Angry Birds, Cut the Rope, and other things to engage kids. Company, the company actually, all of our therapy apps are out there. We have a Georgia Tech company that actually sells and provides this as a resource to clinicians, schools, school districts, special education teachers. So it can continue on beyond my one-to-one and with my students beyond this world of Georgia Tech. And thanks to my collaborators. And so with that, I am ending.
We have time for a few questions.
Thank you so much for your talk. One of the things that you said about thinking about limitations in the first place, how can we kind of adopt that mindset of setting expectations of like who the user is going to be and what they're going to do, and like actually translate that to users?
I'm gonna let this, and then answer your question, because I just like this. Okay, so I'm done. I just read that part. Okay, I'm sorry. That's like one of my favorite transition points. So one of the things I really believe is, as technologists, we don't engage domain experts as much as we should. We tend to even now sometimes we'll be like, oh, let's do this because it's low impact. We're looking at trust and self-driving cars. Yeah, we'll make up our stuff without actually going to, say, the cognitive scientists and saying, oh, how do people interact with new technologies, and does this look correct? I really believe that we should do more of that instead of making it up from scratch, even though we believe it's true. There's other groups that have looked at, now of course, they haven't used real hardware, right? So, but they've thought about some of these problems from more of a, higher calling kind of thing, but they could provide us a lot more insights. And so I think that's really how we solve it.
Thank you.
If you were to do the clinical study again, what would you do to improve the accuracy for pathway?
So the accuracy means changing our model. And there's been a bunch of suggestions, and at the beginning we tried, we thought, well, maybe it's this gravitational concept, maybe, but two things is we actually started deep diving, we added and we tried doing, and we got a little bit better, and our clinician said stop, right? Because that is our ego thing. I want to be able to write that, we made 95%, right? And her thing was there's so many other things that you can do, that's just mine. Let's go out, let's take these robots out, let's do these long term. And that's one thing, whereas if you take that same amount of time to figure that out, it'll be a great, awesome paper and people will reference it, but that means that that's 16 weeks that you're not making a difference in a kid's life. It still drives me crazy though. I mean, it does, right? Every time I look at it, I'm like, yeah, doesn't actually work. But that's the reason why we just dropped it. And one day I'll get a really smart research scientist. I'll be like, I don't care, I'm just gonna figure it out. Other question?
So I thought that what you were saying about how in clinical settings, you need to spend a ton of time talking about your limitations and a smaller amount of time talking about your success. Has that shifted the way you think at all or write at all for more technically oriented publications? I
do. Sometimes to the detriment of my students, but I think it's important enough. They get enough out there. Mm-hmm. But what I'm also starting to see is that some communities they're doing things like reproducibility tracks, because it is a concern in our community, and so we're starting to actually publish in that, and that world. It's still kind of new. It's still kind of like, what does this mean in terms of reproducibility? But I think that's a good step in terms of being able to show that it works in this case and doesn't work in this case. And I mean, how many of you have like deployed someone else's algorithm and be like, oh yeah, it says it should work, right? And it does not. And you email like, oh, and like, oh yeah, let me tell you something about that study, right? Like, this is horrific for our community. So I'm starting to see a little bit of hope for that. I think that's really what we need more so in everything.
A slight follow-up on that. Have you, when you write these limitations in this way to a technical venue, how has the reviewer response been? That's what I'm sort of curious.
So that's what I'm saying. Sometimes it's to the detriment of the students. But it's a, so we're starting, I'm starting to be strategic of where we publish like the technical, because I do have to be concerned about my students' career. And so this year, just this year, what we started to do is write down these limitations and do them in special things like a reproducibility track or in a journal, which is not as, but in the clinical world, but in a journal, which is much more accepting. And then the other stuff, like writing up everything, like technical, going deep, and then referring and referencing and saying, oh, and there's a bunch of limitations. Please go look here. It's if anyone has any other suggestions, because I do worry about my students as well, because like last year, like our hit rate was like horrible, right? And like I'm like, my hit rate's really good, and so I had to rethink this year. So I have no solution on how to fix our community like now. Other questions?
You mentioned several times cognitive age, which I assume is different than actual age. I was wondering if you'd say more about that and like differences between boys and girls and even how that's measured.
Yeah, so we look at cognitive age between 5 and 10, sometimes you go up to 12. So cognitive age at 5 is basically the ability to understand cause and effect, like the things we're looking at, ability to understand cause and effect, ability to follow instructions or know the sequence of instructions. Those are a requirement for you to be able to interact with the game. And that, in terms of developmental, happens at around, you know, like a 4-year-old can, but by 5, like, that should be something you know. But what that means is, depending on your limitations, you might be a physical age of 10, but not understand cause and effect. So you wouldn't, that would be part of our exclusion criteria.
So sometimes when you are like in the ER, there is like a difference between what you think you're doing and what you're actually doing in the real life. Did you do something to like tackle this issue?
Yeah, so what we found is that what's most important is you understanding the relationship of what you're doing to the objects in question. So even though it's kind of turned and kind of backwards, the fact is that if there's an object that you have to grab or touch, and we do like a practice session where we kind of go through a practice game. It really takes us literally, we can do 10 kind of grabs, you get it. It's like, and again, that deals with at a cognitive age of 5. You retrain that. I don't know what I'm doing, but I can see that if there's there, I know where my hand is with respect to whatever it is I have to grab. So it takes about 10 trials for you to figure it out if you don't know, or if you're confused.
We'll have time for one more question.
I wonder, how do you think about issues of privacy related to this interesting intersection of vulnerable populations and AI machine learning and patient data? It seems really challenging.
It does. So unfortunately, we keep everything local to a device. It also means, like during our studies, like luckily it's not my students, but it's the students, the therapy students actually have to go and download the data and things like that, because we can't just upload it and like we don't have like HIPAA compliant servers here at Georgia Tech, right? And there might be some somewhere, but my lab doesn't have them. And so that's the way we've addressed it.
So nothing's going into an EHR system at any point?
No,
okay.
Not right now. And As soon as we do that, the way we do our studies totally changes. We're actually doing, it's been 2 years getting this through. We're about to start an fMRI offset to actually see what's going on in terms of the white brain matter. And that one requires us to, and it's like, I'm like, I don't ever want to, and this one is important because there was like one study ever on children with CP and fMRIs, right? So we really want to do this study, but it's taken us 2 years to address all these issues, which is painstaking for a researcher, right?
All right, so let's thank Ayanna. Thanks so much for your talk. And coffee break is downstairs.
Yes. And we're back here at 10:30?
10:30, yeah, we should be back here
Yeah.
for another session. Thanks so much, Ayanna. I actually have a question.
Yes.
So a lot of the work we do in the community is around generating content for games, like having games that are adapted.
Right.
Have you used any sort of games that adapt the?
Yeah, so ours adapt based on, well, they adapt very
I can clarify that.
Thank you. So, like, for example, we've done a work with the Lord. Totally fine and adapts and actually so no, so
I see.
It works.
Okay.
But this is more of like right.
If the clinician knows how the system would adapt, pretty much.
You're all good.
Okay, let's go ahead and get started. We're in our first technical session this morning is on reinforcement learning. We have 3 primary research talks followed by a DC talk. And the first talk is actually one of the nominated Best Paper Awards for macro actions in StarCraft, and Sijia Xu will be presenting this work.
Thanks. Hello everyone. I'm from Bilibili. Bilibili is a Chinese company, and his business is most about the video sharing and game platform. And most of the popular video are ACG related. It means animation, comic, and games. And last year we have developed a bot and joined the AIIDE StarCraft competitions. Actually, it's my first time to join these competitions, so it is really happy here to share some of our thinkings about this work. Okay, let's start. Back to last year when the Alpha Star has not shown up, and the action, the ability of the StarCraft bot is still far behind the human player, and we do not have some clear direction about how to improve these abilities. Back to last year, we think the most important reason about the problem is there are too many hard code in the bots. So this hard code logic prevents the bots to be intelligent. So our direct motivation is if we can build a bot through some machine learning method, then it can be much smarter in different situations. Yes, but here the question is there are so many actions in StarCraft, very complicated. So we categorize it into 2 parts, macro and micro. The macro part is relatively difficult, so I will talk that later. For the macro action part, it can be seen in these pictures. Our model just control the high-level action selection. Once the action is selected, the detailed action execution is also controlled by the hard code. Yeah. Okay. Next, we will talk about some related work about the some other parts. The traditional way to do the model is to data mining from the professional players replace. And we think this method has some limitations. And the biggest limitation we think is that the professional players macro has large difference with our proposed bots. Let's see the videos. This video shows the macro from a professional human players. The Protoss players and when they choose harass the Zerg. Normally, one Zerg can kill about 2 Zerglings against the huge number, about 6 to 8 Zerglings, and stay alive for a short time, about 10 seconds. But for this professional player, this Zerg eventually kill about 5 Zerglings and stay alive for more than 30 seconds. Let's see this. Yeah. It's really amazing macro. So from this video, it can be seen that if you have a good enough macro, then it means you can use a relative smaller number of the unit to kill the enemies. This may have the directly influence of the choice of the production of the unit or the production of the buildings. Yes. Okay. Next. And the other way we do the macro action selections in AIIDE competition is the banded learning method, UCB1, over several predefined macro actions. I just draw 2 opening strategies. In most cases, both only use the UCB1 once in the start of the game, but for Cherry Pie, it can use that throughout the game because he defines several in-game strategies. The UCB1 method are generating from the expert knowledge, so it is simple to implement and very effective in practice. But its problem is its granularity is very coarse, so making this method less accurate. So we want to take a step further to use reinforcement learning to do the action level module control. Yeah. Compared with the above 2 method, R has several beneficial, like it used the self-generated reward to get the learning, so the macro has directly matched both macro abilities. Yes, and so on, the two. And next we will go to some detail about our macro bots. So first I give the bot architecture. It's a general loop about the macro action loop. Yeah. There are two process in each actors. The one is the StarCraft game and the BWIPDR injected, and the other is the Python process which runs the TensorFlow modules. Once the production queue is empty, it will ask for new actions, and they set the current state, and the module generate a new action and return to the game to do execution. Concretely, for our IR module, there are two main problems. First is the sparse reward, and second is the partial observations. So, well, for these two problems, we think the sparse reward may be have much bigger impact on the performance, because agent cannot get reward may be much severer than the agent get included reward. Yeah. We started at the explanation of the sparse reward problems. In this map, in the middle of the map, you can see agent. It represents its start state, and the boundary represents the terminal state. In most terminal state, it just can return the negative values reward. So it cannot. It's very hard for the agent to get the improving results. So we can see from concrete examples. It is a replay from our training. The opponent here is the Protoss players. This video shows the general strategy of the opponent. You can see that in the opening strategies, it is to build many cannon in the choke point, and this defense is very stable. Then it chooses to produce the carrier, the most powerful Protoss unit, so from the view of our IR agent, it is very hard to defeat the XMP in the early game and in the middle game. Back to the previous slide, it means it cannot get some positive reward in the early game and in the nearby early game and the nearby middle game. Just in the later game, it can get some positive reward. Yes, so the sparse reward problem is this. Usually we have several ways to deal with this problem. First is reward shaping, and the second is improve the scalabilities. For the first reward shaping, we use a modified terminal reward. We use the score generated from the game engine to recalculate the reward. The advantage of using this reward shaping is, even though we are keeping get the negative reward, we can also get the improvement in the result. You can look at these examples. Although these two games are both return the negative rewards, the match one is obviously better than the match two. Yeah. So we do some experiment to analyze the some different settings. Our experiment is all done on this 6 opponent. Then we use our bot on the different settings to train against this 6 opponent. The win rate is evaluated by the actor with the 0 exploration rate at different training time. According to this experiment, when without the reverse shaping, the green line, you can see that the SMP's win rate is kept as 0. In contrast, in the baseline, you can see the win rate is close to 1. Yeah. Another big problem, another method to deal with the sparse reward is the scalability. Scale up just. We use the AIIDE DQN. It is the framework proposed by DeepMind, and last year it combined many optimization of the DQN. So, according to its paper, it does very good to some well-known sparse reward Atari games like Montezuma's Revenge. So. The idea behind the AIIDE is relatively simple. Just use a large number of the actor to increase the number of the positive reward instance, and combine with the prioritized replay to ensure the sufficient training of this. So we think it is a rather easy way to solve the difficult sparse reward problem. but the condition is if you have enough money to support you. Yeah. This is our general training framework. We have only one learner here, but we have 2,000 PC. And 2,000 PC is hosting 1,000 match in parallel. And each PC's architecture is the same as described in the above slide. You can see the performance consistently improve as the number of actors increase. It is a very promising result of the scale up. Yeah. It also the same conclusion in the 8x sequence paper. We also do some further analysis of the 8x DQN and find that the low exploration rate on the actors may play a key role to the overall performance. If we increase the exploration rate, the performance drops. The reason here may be in 8x DQN it uses a multi-step target. It is not, in theory, not that correct to use on policy setting multi-step TDN in the off policy algorithm like DQN. So, but with a low explosion rate on the majority of the actors, it is equal to get on policy instance with little noise. So this combination improves the overall performance. Another big problem in our R model is the partial observation. It caused by the forward wall in the SC. It caused the MDP process to be the POMDP, partial observation MDP. In theory, it is very hard to effectively solve these POMDP problems. And the common work around here is to introduce the sequence model like the LSTM and the transformer. So the intuition here is the agent can get a more accurate guessing or overfitting about the current hidden enemy information using its state information in the timestamps. Actually, it will be definitely better than just using the current state to do the guessing or the fitting. Yeah, it is straightforward, I think. Our method is followed by the recurrent DQN papers schemas. We just add the estimate layer to our 8x DQN. The model architecture can be seen like this. First is some FC layers and followed by the LSTM layers. And we use the 30-step LSTM and use just the last step's output to the policy part. And the dual network part is the 8x DQNs and some optimizations. Okay. We do some investigation, the LSTM layers influence. You can see that against the Skynet and SMP, without the LSTM, the performance dropped a little. The red line here. Yeah. And okay, in order to get a better performance in the last year's competition, so we enlarge our training set. This time not the C6 board, but we include all the boards in the 2017 competitions. It's about 28 opponents. Yeah. Finally, our board following the above method achieved about 83% remove rate and outperforming 26 boards. The finalists can be seen as this. Our board name is last order, and you can see except these three boards, iron, purple wave, and microwave. Its win rate against us is roughly above the 50%. Other boards, for other boards, the win rate is actually largely below the 50%, meaning that our boards can find the effective macro actions. Yeah. We can use the same pre-trained board to attend the last year's competition and run 11th in total 25 boards. Actually, it's really not a good rank, but it has several reasons. The performance drop, mainly because first one is some opponents' macro is largely better than ours, which will very limit the usage of our models. Yeah. And the other is our model's training against the terrorists is insufficient, and there are only 4 terror bots in our training set. Yeah. Despite this, the lucky thing is, despite these 2 reasons, our bots can get on the rest of the bot set. Our bot win rate is close to the offline evaluation result. So at least I can write a paper. And that's all for the last year's work. Our entire framework is open source at this place, so welcome to start. And finally, I also want to share some of our thinkings after the last year's competitions. Actually, after some review, we decided to temporarily stop the SCAI directions and move on to do other related things. The reason here is we find two main constraints about the current macro models, and they may be hard to overcome. Yeah. The first constraint is the bot's performance is highly constrained by the hard-code macro, and the second is it is highly constrained by the fixed training opponent. We look at the first one. We call it we not do the fully reinforcement learning. Imagine if the hard code part is trivial, if it contributes little to the overall performance, and it is okay to keep that. But the macro part is the key part of the SCA engine. So this hard code part has much impact on the overall performance. And here, maybe the solution is the reinforcement learning also on this part, but it turned out to be very difficult. First, if we want to use the multi-agent way to do that, to our knowledge, the multi-agent reinforcement learning has no practical solution to it, especially on the StarCraft such large-scale combat thing. And for the another way, another way is the single agent way. It is also the alpha stars ways. But the action space is very large and is also very hard to train. The action in the alpha star is very special. They need the extra parameters in each action. Normally, this parameter has the continual value, so it largely enlarges the action space. And the second constraint is we are training against a fixed set of the opponent. Using this training mode, the bot's ability cannot exceed the opponent too much. You can imagine the top performance of the opponent set is the upper boundary of our bots. So that's not what we want. The solution here may be the self-play training. It means self-play means you train against the moving and the improving bot set, which is from our self-training history. But it also seems infeasible to macro because it maybe has a big overhead. And even despite this overhead, we think the improvement of the self-play only on the macro part is very limited. Okay, to sum up, if we want to build a bot learning from itself and improving with no upper boundary, that is also our goal. Then the bot must be fully control its important actions. That means it must be do fully reinforcement learning, not the partial reinforcement learning. And the bot must do self-play training against an improving training set, not against a fixed training set. And it is also our focus in the future work. Thanks. Sure.
So we have time for one, maybe two questions while the next speaker is setting up.
Thank you. This is a very inspirational talk. I'm actually wondering about since in the reward shaping section, you are talking about since the reward is so sparse, you're using the in-game score as a training let's say as a reward matrix. But yesterday on the analysis of this year's StarCraft competition, we were talking about scores maybe inverse from the win-lose. So some bot can win, but it can has a lower score. Did you observe any? Did that border your training? Did you observe anything wrong?
Yeah. Actually, reverse shaping need much careful hand turning. Yes, it can involve much expert knowledge in that. So, it's very tricky actually.
But that worked.
Yeah, that works. It's very tricky. It's all from your expert knowledge.
Thank you.
Okay, let's thank the speaker. The next two talks are from the Borealis AI Lab, which is in Edmonton, and Bill O'Cartel is going to be giving both of these talks, but we'll treat them as two separate talks. So the first one is agent modeling as auxiliary task for deep reinforcement learning.
That's better for sure. Collaborative, yeah. I can't even see where your cursor is. Up, down, right, right more, right, up, yeah. Oh! Up, yes. Enter. See? Yeah. Okay, now up.
Just be able to switch back to.
Yeah.
There you go.
There you go.
How do I present?
Keep going.
Down.
Okay.
Up.
No, that's the print button.
Is there a shortcut?
Yeah, there's
Does F5 work?
It temporarily should.
Does it
Oh,
work?
yeah,
That's the right and right hand
I
button.
think it's
Oh, that's for PowerPoint.
Down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
Control
Press.
Okay. So I guess I have to be like this to see what's going on. So this will be two talks, and the first talk will be a bit longer than the second one, but there is quite an overlap between the talks. So, and please feel free to interrupt anytime if you have a question. So this is joint work with Pablo, myself, and Matt Taylor. And this work is actually led by Pablo, but I'm only attending, so I will present all the talks. So the outline will be basically want to talk about reinforcement learning as a background material, and the auxiliary task, which is kind of the main contribution of the talk. And then I will present the agent modeling as an auxiliary task and results and conclusions. So reinforcement learning, basically, we have an agent and we have an environment, and agent basically interacts with the environment by taking actions, and environment provides the agent the next state and some reward signal, and agent tries to learn basically by trial and error. But in contrast to supervised learning, there's no other signal besides the external reward from the environment. And the core challenge in reinforcement learning is balancing exploration and exploitation. And this is essential for especially continually learning systems. So, can we use deep reinforcement learning for multi-agent domains? Yes. Does it work? Kind of. Doesn't show the video. Okay. Assume that you see a video here. On the left, we have the mini Pomerman domain, where basically the red agent is our agent. And this is kind of actually, Diego presented yesterday about the suicide problem in the Pomerman domain. So agent basically, while learning, it places a bomb and then it walks into its own flame because the bomb explodes 10 time steps later. So it takes so long. Now there, yeah.
Yeah.
So red agent is our agent and the blue is the opponent, and it's just staying there. But you can see our agent placing a bomb and then forgets about it, dies. And sometimes it places a bomb next to the opponent, but it doesn't go away, so they both die. The game ends with a tie, and they both get -1 as a reward signal. So essentially, you can see that this is a very toxic domain, I think, for reinforcement learning. So on the right, this is like a transport domain. So there are two agents. You can see the thing in the middle is an object, and the object is moved only when both agents take the same action. So it requires kind of perfect coordination to move the object, and the target is to take that object all the way to up. And here you can see that because our agent doesn't know what the other agent is going to do, and it also tries to explore, it takes forever to take the object to the up, and it only gets a reward when the object is at the target. And sometimes they actually split. So the point is, in multi-agent, things just get harder. Okay, I continue. So now I will give some background on deep reinforcement learning algorithm and the auxiliary task, and which is kind of the main contribution for the both talks. What is A3C? So A3C is one of the state-of-the-art deep reinforcement learning algorithms, and it stands for Asynchronous Advantage Actor Critic, which is many words, but I try to explain. So it uses an actor critic method. Actor critic here means that basically there is a policy which gives us the action probabilities. And there's a critic, which is the value, which says, if you take this action, if you under this policy, this is kind of the expected reward, expected return you will get. And for this neural network, the parameters are fully shared, the representation learning, but the heads for the actor and critic are different. The name advantage is in the algorithm because it uses an advantage function. So here, for reinforcement learning setting, we have the return. So return is basically possibly discounted sum of rewards from the current time step. So the value function here is basically what is my expected reward if I am following a policy. The advantage function is basically among the possible action at the current time step, how much better a particular action from the average. And then basically in A3C algorithm, advantage function is used to reduce the variance, because if I know I took this action and this action was some percent better than the average, I can actually use this information when I compute the loss. And with this, it kind of helps with variance reduction in policy gradient methods. And the loss function consists of three separate parameters. So we have the loss for the critic, we have the loss for the policy, and the last term is basically entropy, which is to prevent the algorithm to converge prematurely to some policy. It just kind of provides more exploration. If, for example, the action probabilities are picked into one action, we have a higher entropy loss. This way, we will try to explore other actions as well. Auxiliary tasks. So auxiliary tasks have been used for quite a while, actually. They have been shown to kind of improve almost actually like 30 years ago, they have been shown they can help neural networks to avoid local minimas. But more recently, they are used for deep reinforcement learning as well. And they are helpful, especially when the external reward is sparse or delayed. And this is a main challenge for many domains. And the idea is that if you don't get feedback from the environment, then you basically have pretty much no signal, no dense gradient to update your network parameters. So if there are self-supervised signals in the environment that the agent can predict and observe without any external help, it can use those predictions about the environment to kind of learn from all the experience, not just the reward. So you can think of like, if it's almost like model learning, that the agent can, for example, try to predict what is going on at some other side of the environment. And maybe this kind of prediction helps the representation learning. And maybe that predicting that really, that different signal can help the policy in a way. So they are kind of heuristics, I would say. They are the automatically finding auxiliary task is still an open problem. There are some recent work with meta learning, but I think we still didn't get there exactly. And they also seem to help a lot for kind of like making these algorithms, deep reinforcement learning algorithms, more stable. So some examples basically are an agent, a navigation agent can also, for example, rather than just trying to find the optimal policy, it can also try to predict what is my depth kind of from the next obstacle and so on. Or for related to games, for example, rather than just trying to maximize the reward, the agent can try to predict, for example, for a game with enemies in the frame, it can try to predict, is there an enemy in this frame? And it's almost like poking the agent to kind of like being able to predict this might help the policy learning a lot. And this is kind of observed in many different ways. Okay, now we came to the contribution, agent modeling. So this is basically the idea is that we want the agent to not only maximize the, optimize the policy, but we also want our agent to predict what the opponent is going to do. So we assume that basically the major assumption here is that the agent can observe what the other agent will do in the next time step. So we assume fully observed scenario. So basically it will predict, and then after the actions are taken, it will see the action, and this will kind of provide a loss. And doing this over time, our agent will be able to actually estimate what the opponent is going to do and possibly exploit that. And agent modeling is helpful. Is helpful for both competitive scenarios, but also for coordination problems. Because if I know what my teammate is going to do, I can focus maybe accordingly to improve our global reward. But maybe it can also be used for testing, for example, game playing agents, to really see if there are any unintended exploitable behaviors to fix them. This might be another way. So here we present kind of the architecture. So on the left, basically we have the standard A3C network architecture. We call it agent modeling by parameter sharing. So basically we have exactly the same architecture, except now besides the actor and critic heads, we have this opponent teammate policy. So rather, besides our own policy, we also predict the opponent policy. And if there are actually more agents in the environment, we could just add one more head per the other agent. So it would just have many heads based on the number of teammates or opponents. The one in C is still serving the same purpose. It's just a more involved network architecture. And the idea is that we want to base this opponent policy prediction not just based on the last layer of the network, but maybe even from the previous representations that are learned. And we want to use those representations to also bias our own policy. And we will compare them experimentally in both domains. So here is just showing that the learning agent component exists in the original network, and the other piece are for the opponent or the teammate policy. And how do we construct the loss? The loss is basically a cross entropy loss. So we have some distribution for the other agent policy, and then we observe a one-hot encoding of the action taken. And from this we have this cross entropy loss, and we can augment this to original A3C by basically computing this loss for all the the below formula is basically just n is the number of agents in the environment. So it can be 1 or maybe there are actually multiple agents in the environment for all of which we are trying to model them. So here we have this transport problem, right? And this is a trained agent. On the right, we see a video of the trained agent with opponent modeling. And the teammate is a non-learning, rule-based stop-burn agent. We call it stop-burn because it doesn't want to go to target, actually. You can see that it's trying to push them towards right. So it makes just the problem a little bit harder to get to the goal. But our agent can still predict what it's going to do, and it can take the coordinated actions to arrive to the goal, even though it's most of the time trying to push the agent towards right. For Pomerman, it's the competitive scenario. It's one-to-one, fully observed, and this is mini Pomerman because experiments take so much time and so much compute. I should mention that the input is not pixel-based. It's basically we get a number of channels, and it's only 2 agents. Each game lasts for 800 time step, and the opponent here is a rule-based one, which is called simple agent by the simulator, which has stochastic behavior, uses Dijkstra, so it's a little bit slower to train against because it runs Dijkstra at every time step. But I would say it's a reasonable agent because it has some skills to get power-ups, avoid blasts, and so on. So here, some experiments on the auxiliary task weight. So because we add this auxiliary loss on top of the standard A3C loss, there is one tunable parameter of how much do we care about actual goal of policy optimization versus how much we care about predicting what the opponent or the teammate is going to do. So we tried on the transport problem, we tried different scenarios, decreasing this auxiliary task weight over time, or fixing the weight for it. And we found variation on the performance, but we ended up using a fixed loss weight of 0.1, which is simpler, and it seemed to show good performance across the domains. So here we have the result for the, again, transport problem. So on the left, you can see that the red one is original A3C, and the performance actually after learning it starts going down. So this is one place I think auxiliary tasks are helping, that the vanilla deep reinforcement learning algorithms, they can actually over time can perform better when you train them more. So sometimes they catastrophically forget and they have to relearn, or they can kind of slowly forget. But with opponent modeling against different types of non-learning teammates, you can see that the red and the blue, they correspond to parameter sharing or learning with policy features. We see more stable performance. And on the right, we also see that the variance of our proposed methods are actually smaller. And these curves are obtained from, each curve is obtained from 10 training days. So if you look at the results in the Pomerman domain, this is against the rule-based opponent, simple agent. Loss of carbon footprint is 50 CPUs and trained for 3 days. And each curve obtained of 5 separate runs. So this is loss of experiments, and I would say. But you can see that the red one is the baseline, A3C. Both methods improve upon the baseline. And I will show a video now that actually with opponent modeling, our agents find an exploit in the opponent and use this strategy to kind of like win the games.
You're out of time. Do you want to use it part of the next one?
The next presentation is shorter. So here, something I want to mention is there is this recent work about kind of understanding the EQN. So we have these agents, we train these agents, but their performance is, we see the numbers. Yes, this agent, train agent, gets this much of rewards and so on. But we don't really know what they are doing, why they are doing that, and I think this is a very interesting research area now, like trying to explain these agents and so on. And in this work, basically, they take a trained DQN agent, and they basically take the activations of the last layer from the neural network, and they apply this TSNE. TSNE is basically a clustering algorithm, and you can see that each cluster actually is kind of like corresponding to almost like different skills, I would call them, in the game. So it shows that the kind of some set of parameters are activated together to accomplish different things. And so we kind of try to apply the same thing for our trained agent. So when we applied the TSNE for two trained agents, one with standard A3C and the other is basically the opponent modeling with parameter sharing. And the y-axis is basically the value is obtained by doing an inference through the value function. And you can see that we have this really nice cluster on the right, which has a really high value, which means that for those set of parameters, our agent is certain that it's going to win the game. And the other reason that we show this is basically showing that adding the opponent modeling actually makes a significant change in the network parameters. So this is a video of a trained agent with opponent modeling. So you can see that it can place bombs, avoid them. But in this configuration, our agent actually forced the opponent to commit suicide. The blue is the opponent. Because what happens is, under certain conditions, this opponent takes a deterministic action. And our agent can predict that. And if both agents try to go to the same cell, this is a simultaneous game, they both stay at their current position. So our agent knows where the opponent is going to go. So our agent also wants to go to that same exact cell. So they both stay in their current position. But the thing is, the opponent is sitting on a bomb. And the time passes and it dies. So we see this behavior with opponent modeling, but we didn't see this behavior with the standard A3C, which kind of shows that our agent model kind of like exploits this. So conclusion, agent modeling improves stability in cooperative and competitive scenarios. In some cases, it improves the rewards. For future work, we want to see for mixed environments, also maybe how would this perform against learning agents.
So we're borrowing time from the next talk, but we can take questions here, and then we'll continue the next talk. So go ahead.
Yes, please.
Can you go back to the network architecture slide?
That's not it.
Oh, sorry. Well, yeah, I think that would be okay. So I'm curious if you tried, after outputting the prediction of the opponent, have you tried adding it as an observation or concatenating that with the final layer? So instead of just sharing the weights, just adding that on the prediction itself.
We didn't try that. I didn't say that.
Do you think it would be something? Do you think it's mathematically equivalent to what you did, or would it be different? Do you think? You might have to see.
Yeah, I think I have to think about it.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think it sounds interesting to try. Yeah. Any questions?
Yeah. When you were saying when your network outputs three things, and one of them is to output your opponent's policy. What do you mean by that? Do you try to output the opponent's next possible location, or do you output the opponent's
It's an action distribution again, like a softmax over the next action. It's basically 6 action probabilities.
Okay, so you know what the opponent's action probability.
So we predict that, and in the next time step we observe what the agent has done. It's a one-hot encoded action.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, please.
And what about a self-play kind of environment? Have you tried to have the opponent play the strategy that you're actually learning?
I think we didn't try that.
Do you think it would be stable the same, or something funny could happen?
So self-play works under some scenarios, right? So I'm not sure if it would still converge under that scenario. So
there's a question here.
yeah.
Did you try? So you were predicting your opponent's actions. Did you play at all with the time that you predicted, like maybe one step in the future, so you're predicting how they would react to you instead of what they're doing at the same time? Or did you play at all, like which point in time you're predicting your opponent's action?
I see. Yeah, currently only for that instantaneous, but it would be interesting to extend this to over time.
Okay, we're going to make sure we have time to finish the next. If you have questions at the end of the next talk, you can always ask about this talk as well.
Yes.
So let's go ahead and move to the next talk and thank the speakers. And then welcome the same speaker for terminal prediction.
Yes.
And so we'll let it continue here.
So there is so much overlap between two talks. So it's auxiliary task again, but now it's not opponent modeling, but it's terminal prediction. And same set of authors, just the first order split. So deep reinforcement learning is cool. We had some success stories, but what is the main problem? Sample efficiency. This is kind of something that they discussed yesterday. For example, OpenAI 5 uses 180 years of gameplay data each day by using thousands of CPUs and GPUs. That's a lot, right? So one way to address the sample efficiency is basically using auxiliary tasks. It doesn't give us maybe 10x speed up in sample efficiency, but in some domains we can get maybe 2x, 3x speed up. So I skipped this because we already talked about it. And auxiliary tasks. I just want to show there is, for example, there are so many different auxiliary tasks you can think of. They are like heuristics. This is another one, for example, where the agent tries to predict what is my next reward is going to be. So the idea here is that the agent, anything can be set up as an auxiliary task where an agent can make a prediction and it's going to observe that. As long as there is no external feedback necessary, you can set that up as an auxiliary task, and if the feature learned by that is helpful for the policy, then might help. So now we come to the contribution. The contribution is basically kind of giving an agent a kind of a capability to time. So for example, the agent will kind of predict how close it is to episode termination. And this information might be useful. And this is actually, we recognize this after we wrote the paper. Reed Sutton actually, in a paper 2011, he mentions that maybe we care about how many more moves the game will last, right? If you know that, maybe you can change your strategy, or you can do different things. If you think of even game theoretically, maybe you are cooperating and getting good rewards both of time. But if you know the game is going to end in 2 time steps, you can maybe not cooperate and get more for the remaining ones. And the architecture is kind of similar. We have this parameter sharing architecture. We have this additional head for the terminal prediction. And the loss is mean square error here. So we have the predictions and we have the labels, and we add the auxiliary loss on top of the standard A3C loss. So what are the labels though, right? The important thing is we make the prediction, but what are the labels, self-supervised labels? So the way we compute the label is, if you assume an episode has a length of 100, then we assume that the label basically for the first observation is 0 and for the last observation is 1. So we assume linear interpolation. That's an assumption. But the thing is, reinforcement learning agents update very frequently, let's say every 10 time steps. But you get to know how long the episode is only when the episode is over. So there are 2 ways. One way is kind of updating these laws in an asynchronous fashion. That's fine, but then if you deploy this to kind of like many distributed actors, there's going to be loss of memory because you have to keep the computation graph for the gradients. So what we did in this work to overcome that issue is basically we keep track of the average episode length over the, let's say, last 100 episodes to approximate the actual episode length, because generally the policy length correlates with the policy. I mean, the reward expected from the policy. So we use that instead of the actual N. We use the same domain, fully observable. And for opponents, we have the static one and we have the rule-based one. And the results here is basically showing that these are on the left, we have against the static opponent, trained for 6 hours with 24 CPUs. And you can see that the terminal prediction ones learns a lot faster, about 3x improvement. Against the rule-based opponent is trained for 3 days with 24 CPUs and finds a better policy. We also tried this on Atari games and this continuous action space one bipedal walker. So in some Atari games we see improvement, in some they get the same performance, but we really don't know why. So there's something to really to try to understand why terminal prediction works for some domains really well, but not well for some other domains. So the conclusions are auxiliary tasks enable faster representation learning. Terminal prediction is very simple to integrate into any deep reinforcement learning algorithms, but it's only applicable for episodic domains, not for non-episodic ones. In Pomerman, we showed that experimentally against different types of opponents, it performs better. And in Atari and bipedal walker, we see similar or slightly better performance. And there are actually many future work directions. If there are people interested in deep reinforcement learning trying to extend the ideas. So the first one is basically really trying to understand why this works for some domains and not for the other ones. The second one, we can use terminal prediction to bias exploration. If my agent predicts the game is about to end, and it predicts that it's going to lose under this strategy, then why still follow this strategy, right? We can try out other things. The third one, if I know the episode is going to end in 5 time steps, why would I care about rewards far away from that 5 time steps? Maybe I could use that to dynamically set my discounting in the MDP. The fourth one, if there is a demonstrator available to help the agent sometimes, but maybe this advice is limited, we could use TP to ask for it. For example, if the terminal prediction is high, and again the value is low, then I could ask help. And the last one is kind of more experimental, combining all these different auxiliary tasks and see how they behave together. And that concludes my talk. Thank you.
So lots of time for questions.
Could you maybe go back to the slide about where some of them are doing better and some are doing the same?
Yes.
Is there a way, I mean, not necessarily for testing your method, but just in general to verify that knowing how far you are away from terminating is helpful? Like, it strikes me that maybe in some of these tasks, even if you had a perfectly accurate way of measuring how far you were away from the end, that may not improve your performance at all, and so that could be the reason that it's not.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's not necessarily helping, right? I think terminal prediction, I see it is more like because of the increase in a lot of improvement in the Pomerman domain. The way I see it, maybe for really extremely sparse reward domains, this kind of like maybe stabilizes the learning, because you get the loss from terminal prediction anyway. Right, as long as that predictor is not perfect while learning. So maybe the kind of the optimizer is not stuck in the loss landscape somewhere. So it might be more helping in that way. Yes, please.
Hi, thanks for the inspiration. I mean, in the future work, I think you mentioned that I mean, TP can be helpful for determining, I mean, when to ask for demonstrators' help.
Yeah.
Would you mind giving us more inspiration on this? I mean, since you are talking about, let's say, when the game is going to end, the agent should ask more questions. I mean, is it the case? Is it not? Or should we actually train another policy to know when to ask for these?
I think that's a good point. Yeah. So this falls under the interactive reinforcement learning, where there is generally a tutor that can help the learning agent. And so yeah, in the literature there is already work on kind of trying to determine the schedule of the advice. And I think one heuristic could be to use it towards the end, or another thing would be actually train another network, as you suggest, to really determine when to get the help. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
So you presented between the two talks several different types of auxiliary tasks. I wonder if you could, if you have any intuition that you could share about how to choose an auxiliary task for a domain, and relatedly, what is the risk of choosing an auxiliary task poorly and actually is detrimental to reinforcement learning for a given domain?
Yeah. So there's some recent work on this actually, that trying to show that auxiliary tasks sometimes can hurt the performance.
Yeah.
And it tries to kind of like, if you have many auxiliary tasks available for the same task at the same time, it tries, some of them tries to see, for example, how much, for the local gradient direction, for example, if the auxiliary task all kind of like is consistent with the main task, maybe that you care about that more than the other one, and so on. But I think it's very like, I would call it very heuristic based, that, for example, terminal prediction is good for like episodic domains, right, where the reward is sparse. But the reward prediction one that I show from the literature is, I think that's good for like dense reward problems, because if you think about it, if you have sparse reward problem and if you try to apply reward prediction, then there is a huge class imbalance between the signal, right, between the label. Then that's a hard, then you can't really utilize the signal efficiently to learn. But reward prediction can be used for example, for episodic or non-episodic ones. I think it really depends on the domain, how to choose it. It's not, I don't see it like I throw all the auxiliary tasks and then, but maybe again, you have another network that chooses which auxiliary task to use, like a hierarchical one.
We can take one more question before we go to the last talk. Or we can go straight to the last talk.
Okay. Thank you.
So our last talk is a doctoral consortium presentation on standardizing the evaluation of digital managers for better interactive experiences. And Giulio Mori will be presenting the work.
Hello everyone, I'm Giulio Mori, and I'm first year PhD student at Reykjavik University in Iceland. And today I will present you what I want to do in my PhD, that is standardize the evaluation of experience managers. An experience manager is an AI system that is able to manage an experience inside an application while this experience is underway. Actually, right now, the experience management as a field has two lacks. That there is no standard language for describing experience management tasks, and there is no comprehensive platform for evaluating and compare these systems. So my objective during my PhD is to build a general language for expressing experience management tasks, and then using this language develop a platform for evaluating and comparing this experience manager. I want to do so by drawing inspiration from the general game playing as a field, where a general game playing system is one that gets a formal description of the game and then played it without the human intervention. I want to do something, if you can say so, similar, where I get an experience manager system described as a language, and I want to put in this platform where I can try to evaluate it. So that's it.
Okay, thank you for coming to the session this morning. We have a 2-hour lunch break, and then we'll resume here in the
Actually,
afternoon.
we should be back here at 12:30 if you're interested in the committee meeting where we're going to discuss the reviewing process and what we're going to do for next year AIIDE. So if you're interested in